The executive chair of Sky Global Airlines sat empty in the boardroom on the 40th floor, morning light cutting through the glass walls and reflecting off tense faces. On the table, a 200-page report lay open to its first page, the title striking like a gunshot: Independent Investigation Report, Evidence of Systemic Deliberate Discrimination within Sky Global Airlines. The room fell silent. A few executives held their breath. Others lowered their heads, avoiding each other's eyes. They all knew what had just been exposed was more than personal misconduct. It was a moral fracture running through the deepest layers of an empire once considered the pride of America's aviation industry. Dozens of complaints, hundreds of internal emails and videos secretly recorded by employees, all pointed to the same conclusion: Sky Global had been discriminating by design against people of color, against women, against anyone who didn't look like they belonged in first class, and the name that ignited it all: Ethan Carter. A year earlier, Ethan had been nothing more than a passenger on a flight from Atlanta to San Francisco, a black man, 46 years old, the CEO of Innovate Systems, a technology company worth hundreds of millions. He boarded the plane with a smile, wearing a tailored suit and carrying a presentation that could change his company's future. But 10 minutes later, he was forced to leave his first-class seat. Not because of a booking error, but because a white businessman who arrived late looked more deserving. That moment, standing in the aisle under dozens of stares while the flight attendant spoke to him with polite condescension, became the spark that would set the entire corporation ablaze. 1 year later, that same corporation now sat in an emergency meeting, listening as investigators revealed evidence, one by one, internal manuals, instructing staff on how to handle passengers who don't fit the premium image, secret ranking charts, rating flight attendants based on their ability to maintain the brand's prestige, meaning prioritizing white male passengers in suits or wearing expensive watches, and worst of all, dozens of lawsuits that had been quietly buried under non-disclosure agreements and intimidation clauses. No one dared to look at each other. One executive whispered, "My God, what have we done?" Another snapped back. Not us. It was the frontline staff. But the lead investigator cut in coldly. "No, ladies and gentlemen, this was policy, not a mistake. It came from the top." The sentence landed like a punch to the heart of power. The meeting dragged on for more than 7 hours. In the end, the board voted. Thomas Wilson, the current CEO, was forced to resign. Within a single morning, Sky Global's stock dropped nearly 10%. What remained was a void, both literal and moral, where a global giant now stood at the edge of collapse or rebirth. As evening light fell over the headquarters, the boardroom doors opened. A woman stepped in her stride, firm, her eyes sharp, the kind of gaze more accustomed to a courtroom than a camera. Mariana Rodriguez, 52 years old, a former federal judge known for her rulings in civil rights cases, the woman chosen to do what no one else dared: purge Sky Global from its roots. On her first day at headquarters, the grand lobby was empty. No welcome banners, no flowers, just rows of employees silently watching her pass. Some curious, others skeptical, a few afraid. Mariana stopped in front of the old company slogan, etched on a wall, "Sky Global, fly the world you deserve." She stared at it for a long moment, then turned to the group of managers following her and said, "It seems we've forgotten who truly deserves this world." Her voice was calm and low, yet carried a weight that silenced the room. She began by dissolving the entire old training department and replacing it with the Bias Intervention Program, the strictest anti-discrimination training the industry had ever seen. Every flight attendant, pilot, and ground crew member was required to complete psychological evaluations and simulated scenarios where the evaluators were undercover passengers of diverse races, genders, and backgrounds. No one will ever hide behind the words misunderstanding, again, she declared in her first internal address. We will measure fairness the same way we measure fuel, precisely, mandatorily, and transparently. During the restructuring, Ethan Carter was invited back, not to seek justice for himself, but to help the airline create real equality. Mariana offered him the position of chair of the Community Advisory Council, an independent body made up of civil rights lawyers, social experts, and people who had personally experienced discrimination in air travel. Ethan didn't answer right away. He looked around the boardroom at the photos lining the walls. Decades of company history, every face white, every smile self-assured. "Are you sure someone like me belongs here?" he asked, half joking, half bitter. Mariana replied without hesitation, "No one belongs here more than you, if we truly want to change." 6 months later, Sky Global released the first transparency report in its history, over 312,000 passenger complaints publicly reviewed, 94 employees dismissed for fairness violations, 17 covert discriminatory policies eliminated. For the first time, the airline established a passenger protection office run by independent lawyers and experts with full authority to investigate any incident without executive approval. The media called it Sky Global Reborn, the rebirth of the skies. But to Mariana and Ethan, they understood it was more than rebirth. It was the first time the sky had truly opened for everyone. One afternoon, in her new office, high above the city, Mariana stood by the window, watching a plane bearing the Sky Global logo ascend. The sunset glimmered on the glass, turning the silver wings into endless streaks of light. Ethan walked in, holding the latest proposal for the community council. "Do you think people will believe this change is real?" he asked quietly. Mariana looked out at the horizon and smiled faintly. No one believes until they feel it. But one day they'll board this plane and be treated as human beings, not as ticket classes. In that moment, neither of them spoke again. Only the fading sound of the engines remained a reminder that justice, too, sometimes needs time to take flight. 7 months after Sky Global officially announced its Fair Skies program, the company's Chicago headquarters had completely transformed. The walls, once covered with glossy marketing slogans, were now filled with real photographs, images of employees of every color, gender, and background, real smiles, real stories. Gone were the posters of perfect white models, replaced by portraits of ordinary people carrying the beauty of diversity. But changing the image was the easy part. Changing the culture that was the real battle. Mariana Rodriguez knew it well. In her office on the 38th floor, she stared at the thick report displayed on her screen, First Quarter Internal Audit Report, Passenger Conduct and Complaint System. One number stood out in red, 273 reported violations, most coming from mid-level staff, who still unconsciously maintained old discriminatory habits. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Maybe some people out there thought change could happen in a few months, but she knew it was like performing surgery without anesthesia. A company had to cut out its own bad habits, ones that had seeped deep into its bloodstream. While Mariana was still buried in data, her secretary announced Mr. Carter has arrived. Ethan Carter walked in still with that quiet confidence, but his eyes carried the weight of someone who had weathered a storm. He placed a stack of papers on her desk. "The proposal to establish the Community Advisory Council," he said. Mariana looked up, her eyes lighting up, as if she had just found the missing piece. "I've been waiting for this," she said softly. The Community Advisory Council was a bold step, something the American aviation industry had never seen before. An independent organization, free from company control, with full access to complaint data and the power to make binding recommendations that Sky Global would be required to follow. Its members included civil rights lawyers, investigative journalists, psychologists, representatives of communities of color, immigrants, people with disabilities, and even passengers who had once experienced unfair treatment. At the center of that list was Ethan Carter, honorary chairman. On the day of the council's launch, the press swarmed the headquarters. Cameras flashed, microphones pointed at Ethan. A reporter asked her tone-sharp, "Mr. Carter, do you really believe a company with a history of discrimination can truly change? Or is this just a PR show?" Ethan smiled, his eyes calm but unyielding. "I believe people can change when they're forced to look truth in the face. As for liars, they reveal themselves the moment the light shines on them." His answer was quoted across major newspapers the next morning. The hashtag #TheNewSkyGlobal went viral nationwide. But to Ethan, the campaign was just a surface. What he cared about were the people inside that system. The internal training sessions began. In a large, white-lit room, 30 employees sat before a projection screen. On it played a video, the story of Ethan himself, the moment he was asked to leave his first-class seat in silent humiliation. When the video ended, the air was heavy. No one spoke. Then a young flight attendant, a white woman around 26 with blonde hair, slowly raised her hand. Her voice trembled. "I never thought of myself as someone who discriminates. But I remember once I looked at a black passenger, and I thought they were in the wrong seat. I didn't say it out loud, but I thought it." The trainer, a black psychologist from New Orleans, smiled gently. That's where it begins. Not with words, but with the first look. In that moment, the silence broke. One by one, hands began to rise. Each person shared a small piece of prejudice they once carried. And through those awkward confessions, Sky Global began to truly change. In the 8th month, the secret passenger program was activated. Volunteers from all walks of life were hired to pose as real passengers. No one knew who they were, where they came from, or what they looked like. A single mother of African descent, a white veteran in a wheelchair, an Indian student, a young Asian entrepreneur. They flew across the country documenting their experiences, submitting independent reports, and the first results nearly brought Mariana to tears. Passenger discrimination complaints among people of color dropped 74% in just 3 months. She stood silently by the window, gazing toward the runway. For the first time in years, she felt the sky had truly opened for everyone. But change didn't come only from systems. It came from people. One day, Ethan received a handwritten letter from Allison Reed, the supervisor, who had once forced him out of his seat. "I've gone through 300 hours of training, 200 conversations with passengers, and countless sleepless nights filled with regret. I used to think I was just following procedure. But now I understand no procedure can replace humanity if the heart remains blind. Thank you for not giving up." Ethan read the letter again and again, each stroke of ink like a scar finally healing. By the end of the year, Sky Global became the first airline to release a quarterly fairness report to the public. At the launch ceremony, Mariana spoke, her voice resonating clearly before hundreds of employees. We no longer hide our mistakes. We talk about them. Because only when we face our failures can we truly grow. Below the stage, Ethan looked up and saw the light reflecting in the eyes of those who had once doubted. Now they were clapping, not out of duty, but out of belief. When the ceremony ended, Mariana and Ethan stepped out onto the balcony, where the sunset bathed the entire runway in gold. "Do you know what I'm most afraid of?" Ethan asked. "What is it?" Mariana replied. "That someday people will forget why we began. They'll call this a media success instead of an awakening, and when that happens, history will repeat itself." Mariana stayed silent for a long moment, then said quietly, "Then we'll write it across the sky. Ethan, so no one will ever forget." As night fell outside the airport, a new billboard lit up with a message, "Sky Global, the sky belongs to everyone." The slogan reflected against the glass walls of Ethan's office, illuminating his silhouette, the man who was once stripped of his seat, now helping the world find its seat in justice. That morning, the sunlight wasn't warm enough to chase away the chill inside the glass-walled office on the 42nd floor of Hale Development Group. Surrounded by expensive paintings and gold-plated skyscraper models, Richard Hale, once hailed as the real estate king of Atlanta, sat in silence. On the table before him lay an open copy of the Wall Street Chronicle, its front page headline stretching across the top Department of Justice: "Launches criminal investigation into the secret dealings between Richard Hale and former Sky Global CEO." Beneath it was an old photograph, Hale shaking hands with Thomas Wilson, both smiling brightly under the flash of cameras. That same smile now appeared again in the morning news, framed by heavy words like bribery, covert benefits, and corporate corruption. Once Richard Hale believed himself untouchable. He knew the right people played by the right rules, or rather knew how to bend them his way. First-class seats always waiting no matter how late he arrived. Penthouse deals closed before they ever hit the market. Multi-million-dollar contracts sealed over glasses of vintage wine at private clubs. Everything ran smoothly until the day Ethan Carter refused to give up his seat. No one could have imagined that such a small act would be the first stone that brought down the tower of power Hale had built over 30 years. During the first months of the investigation, Hale remained confident. He hired the best lawyers, appeared in interviews with the calm arrogance of a man who had never lost. "Just a business misunderstanding," he said. "The media is exaggerating." But then the USB drive submitted by Patricia Evans was made public. It contained dozens of internal emails between Hale and Wilson, requests to ensure priority seating for strategic partners, property deals exchanged for corporate privileges, and most damning of all, a memo detailing how to handle Passenger Carter delicately to protect the company's image. The words were cold, dry, and precise, each line another nail in the coffin of his reputation. When the report aired, Hale Development's boardroom descended into chaos. Major partners like Tri-West Properties, Apex Investments, and Oak Ridge Builders simultaneously pulled out of their contracts. Those who once called him a real estate legend now distanced themselves in silence, as if afraid the scandal might stain them too. A pale-faced young assistant entered the room, voice trembling. "Mr. Hale, our stock has dropped 42% in just 2 days, and the Ethics Committee is requesting that you step down as chairman." The words fell like the final hammer strike. Richard leaned back in his chair and let out a bitter laugh. "So all it takes is one first-class seat to bring everything down." That afternoon, reporters swarmed the building entrance, flashes of light bursting as he stepped out. Mr. Hale, did you bribe Sky Global for special treatment? Do you have anything to say to the victims of the discriminatory policies you benefited from? He didn't answer. But his eyes, tired, resentful, said it all. A proud beast dragged off its throne, still unable to accept that its reign had ended. In his luxurious midtown penthouse, Richard sat alone at a long dining table, red wine swirling in his glass. Outside, the city glowed bright, but inside only the sound of the television filled the air. The federal court has dismissed the lawsuit Richard Hale filed against Ethan Carter, ruling it a baseless act of retaliation, the anchor announced. Additionally, Hale Development Group will be placed under special supervision for 24 months and must reimburse all legal costs to Innovate Systems. Richard's hand trembled as he tightened his grip on the glass. He remembered that day, the day Ethan had been forced to leave his seat. Back then, he thought he was just watching a powerless man trying to hold on to a shred of dignity. Now he understood that powerless man was the sentence for the entire system he believed would protect him. As the investigation into Hale deepened, the media began unearthing his past black construction workers paid less than their white counterparts, contracts rerouted to friendly companies, murky donations to local politicians. The deeper they dug, the clearer the network of corruption became. But this time, no one had the power to cover it up. Ethan Carter, through the Equal Dignity Foundation, offered legal aid to those who had suffered discrimination under Hale's empire. One lawsuit after another, one lonely voice after another, began merging into a rising wave of justice. 3 months later, Richard Hale appeared at his final hearing. His black tailored suit could not disguise the gauntness of his face. Across from him sat the federal prosecutor, and beside them, Ethan Carter, calm of no anger, left in his expression only quiet resolve. The prosecutor asked, "Mr. Hale, are you aware that your actions contributed to years of systemic discrimination in the airline industry?" Richard lifted his head. For a brief moment, his eyes flickered, perhaps the first time he truly saw the consequences of his own doing. "I didn't know," he muttered. "I just thought it was a privilege I deserved." The courtroom fell silent. Ethan closed his eyes, not in triumph, not in satisfaction, but in sorrow. Sorrow for a generation of men who believed privilege was their birthright. When the hearing ended, the sentence handed down was not just for Richard Hale, but for an entire era. He was permanently banned from holding any executive position in a public company, reduced to a minor shareholder in the very firm he had founded. His penthouse was sold, his luxury cars seized. He left the city quietly retreating to a lakeside house in North Carolina. People said that sometimes he still turned on the TV, and whenever Ethan Carter appeared, speaking at a conference or giving an address, Richard would simply turn it off, not out of hatred, but because in that man he saw the version of himself he once had the chance to become and lost. A year later, when the media published an article titled, "Sky Global 1 Year After Reform, The Skies Have Never Been Fairer," Richard read it in silence. Near the end, the writer quoted Ethan's words, "No one is born an enemy, but many choose to become one when they believe justice only exists if it benefits them." Richard folded the paper. The evening light spilled across his face, now older, lined and still as the lake outside his window. In that moment, for the first time in his life, he admitted what he had avoided for 3 decades. It wasn't power that destroyed him, but the belief that power excused his wrongs. And somewhere out there, as a Sky Global plane crossed the sky reflecting the sunset, he whispered, "If only that day I had just let him keep his seat. His words faded into the air, a late confession carried toward the sky where justice at last had found its way to fly. It was a spring morning in Atlanta, and the sky looked freshly washed after a night of rain. The first sunlight of the day streamed through the glass windows on the 24th floor of Innovate Systems headquarters, glinting off a new bronze plaque that read, "Innovate Systems Technology for Human Dignity." Beneath those words stood Ethan Carter, holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. He wasn't looking at the mirror nor at the revenue chart that showed a 30% surge in the last quarter. What he was really looking at was himself 1 year earlier, standing in the narrow aisle of that fateful airplane when every eye turned toward him as if he were an intruder. 1 year. A long year filled with sleepless nights, tearful meetings, and moments of icy resolve. A year that had taught Ethan one unshakable truth. Justice is never free. It always comes with a cost. And sometimes that cost is one's own peace. Behind him, a familiar voice broke the silence. Still drinking black coffee? Never any sugar. It was Aisha Monroe, 43 years old, the Chief Operating Officer of Innovate Systems. Her face was bright with a calm confidence, yet her eyes carried the steady focus of someone who had walked beside him through the storm. "Old habits die hard," Ethan said with a faint smile. Aisha set a thick folder on his desk. "This is the first quarterly report since the Equal Dignity Foundation was established. Revenue is up, but more importantly, our reputation has transformed. Do you know what the media is calling you now?" Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Take a guess." Aisha smirked. The reluctant revolutionary. They both laughed. Yet behind the laughter was a trace of something bittersweet, because they both knew the war against prejudice, even when one leaves scars that never fully heal. A year ago, when the controversy first broke, Innovate Systems nearly collapsed. Clients withdrew contracts, partners hesitated, investors backed away. The boardroom back then was silent, except for the ticking of a clock. A financial director had asked, "You think you can save this company with your pride, Ethan?" His reply was calm. "No, I'll save it by saving its purpose." That sentence is now engraved on the wall by the headquarters entrance, a daily reminder that ethics are not a burden, but an asset. When the storm finally passed, something extraordinary happened. The clients who left came back. The employees who were afraid stayed. And the new ones who joined brought ideals with them. Once a company focused solely on commercial technology, Innovate Systems had reinvented itself as a pioneer in technology for humanity. They developed an AI fairness monitoring system for recruitment, helping organizations detect unconscious bias during interviews. They launched EthosNet, a platform measuring transparency and equity in workplace environments, now being piloted by major corporations nationwide. But more importantly, they changed themselves from within. One afternoon, Ethan gathered every employee in the auditorium, the same one where crisis meetings had once been held. He stepped on stage, no notes, no PowerPoint slides, just the steady voice of a man who had walked through fire. "I know there were moments when you doubted whether we could survive any of this," he said. "But it's the darkest days that teach us the true value of light. We're not just building software, we're rebuilding trust, and trust is the one thing technology can't code. Only people can create it." The entire hall stood in silence. No one cheered, no one clapped right away. It was a quiet moment of pride. The rebirth of Innovate Systems made headlines as the reverse crisis effect. Business schools invited Ethan to speak. He declined most except one MIT, his alma mater, the place where he was once underestimated because of his skin color. As he walked to the podium, students rose to greet him. Ethan smiled, remembering his father's words. "They can take your seat, but they can't take the way you sit." He looked at the audience and said, "Technology changes the world every day, but without ethics, it's just a sharp knife in the hands of the blind. Program justice first, before you program for profit." The hall erupted in applause. Back in the office, Aisha received an email from an investment group, the Consortium for Ethical Innovation, founded by black and female billionaires. The subject line read, "We want to invest in Mr. Carter's dream." Ethan read the words and sat silently for a long moment. He no longer thought about the failures, the sleepless nights, or the insults he once endured. Instead, he thought of the employees who stayed when the company had only 2 months of cash left. He thought of Aisha, the friend who turned down offers from Silicon Valley just to stand by his side in this fight. And he smiled. Finally, he said, "We've proven that justice can be profitable." That night, the city of Atlanta shimmered in light. Innovate Systems hosted its 10th anniversary celebration. Ethan didn't want a grand speech, only one request that every table display a small sign reading "Equal Dignity," the symbol of the foundation he had created. As warm jazz music filled the room, he raised his glass, looking around at faces once weary, now radiant, at a room filled with renewed faith. Suddenly his phone buzzed. A message from Mariana Rodriguez. "I just flew over San Diego on the new Sky Global route." The crew had 4 different ethnicities. A young black attendant greeted me saying, "Welcome aboard, Ma'am." "I thought you'd want to know the sky has changed color." Ethan looked out the window. High above, a silver streak crossed the night sky. Maybe it was a Sky Global plane, maybe a falling star, but in that moment, he knew he was on the right path. Later that night, he returned to his office. On his desk sat a small model of a first-class seat, a gift from his colleagues, engraved with the words, "From humiliation to revolution." Ethan rested his hand on it gently, as if touching a distant memory. "No one is born to change the world," he whispered. "But if the world collides with you first, you're left with no other choice." Outside the buildings of Atlanta glowed like constellations. The same city where he was once humiliated had now become the place where justice was reprogrammed from the ground up. One October afternoon, a gentle breeze swept down Peachtree Avenue, carrying golden leaves that drifted slowly past a brand-new building with a simple yet powerful name, Equal Dignity Foundation. Across its glass facade, the sunset reflected off a line of white steel letters, engraved in silence. Justice is not charity, it's restoration. Inside, Ethan Carter walked down the long hallway, his footsteps echoing steadily. They were not the steps of a businessman chasing profit, but of a man carrying a promise he had made to himself on the night the world made him feel like he didn't belong anywhere. On the desk in the Foundation's first office were files of the very first cases an Indian-American family refused service at a luxury restaurant in Texas, a black couple thrown out of a resort for being off-brand, a veteran downgraded from first class because the staff didn't believe he bought the ticket. These seemingly small stories were scratches on the massive wall of modern society marks that wealth, reputation, or law had never been able to erase. Ethan knew he couldn't change the entire world, but he could build a place where the wounded could finally be heard. On opening day, The press swarmed the lobby. Cameras flashed, microphones crowded forward, and questions came fast. "Mr. Carter, why start this foundation now when you've already won the case?" The fame. Ethan smiled faintly, his eyes calm and steady. "I didn't win," he said. "I just refused to lose. And if someone with my level of privilege could still be treated that way, imagine what happens to those who have no voice." Another reporter asked, "Do you really think this foundation can change anything?" Ethan paused for a few seconds before replying, "No one changes the world in a day. But if we can change one person in a day, that's already a beginning." The launch ceremony was simple. No champagne, no orchestra, just a small stage and a single microphone standing alone in the hall. Aisha Munro introduced the founder. Ethan stepped forward without notes, without bright lights, only his voice, deep, slow, and firm like the beat of a heart. "Equal dignity is not a place that begs for sympathy. We are not asking anyone for help. We are creating the opportunity for people to stand up. Because sometimes what people need is not money, but a hand that says, 'I believe you deserve fairness.'" In the front row, an elderly woman wept. Her name was Marcia Benson, mother of the black man who had been denied entry to first class, even though he had bought the ticket. When Ethan stepped down, she grasped his hand tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not letting my son die in silence." Ethan said nothing. He simply placed his hand on her shoulder and bowed his head. Weeks later, the foundation officially began operations. The phone lines never stopped ringing, and emails poured in from across America. An Uber driver discriminated against. Because of his accent, an Asian student removed from a flight for looking suspicious. A brown-skinned mother denied a hotel room because it was fully booked. Each story was another wound, but also another chance to heal. In an office filled with paperwork, Ethan sat with a team of young lawyers listening carefully to every story. A young Latina woman recalled being treated harshly at a restaurant. "All I want is for them to say sorry," she said softly. "I don't need money, just an apology." Ethan looked at her, his eyes gentle but resolute. "We'll help you get that," he said. "But not just an apology. We'll make sure they change how they treat people after this." One weekend, Ethan visited a small branch office in Dallas, the first place where he had personally intervened. It involved a black couple, John and Rachel Turner, who had been thrown out of a hotel in the middle of the night. When Ethan met them, John was composed, but Rachel broke down in tears the moment she saw him. "I read about you," she said. "I never thought someone like you could understand what we went through." Ethan smiled gently. "Trust me," he said. "I understand more than you think." At the end of their meeting, after signing the support papers, John shook his hand, his eyes glistening. "Thank you, sir," he said. "You didn't just help us. You helped my son believe that the color of his skin isn't a reason to be turned away." Equal dignity grew. From one small office, it expanded across 12 states, handling more than 2,000 cases in its first year. News outlets called Ethan the founder of the dignity restoration movement in public service. But he didn't care for the title. He told Aisha quietly, "I don't want to be called a hero. I just want no one else to ever feel the way I did that year." One night, long after the lights were off, Ethan stayed in the office alone. On his desk lay the newest case, a group of Latino tourists discriminated against at a luxury hotel. He opened his laptop and read through each report, the glow of the screen highlighting his tired yet determined eyes. Suddenly his phone buzzed. A message appeared. "Trevor Parker." Today marks 1 year since your story came to light. I'm now consulting for Mariana's company. Things are really changing. Thank you, Ethan, for teaching me that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing what's right even when you're afraid. Ethan leaned back and sighed softly. Outside, the city lights shimmered on the glass like countless stars. He knew the world was still full of prejudice, still filled with doors slammed shut on the powerless. But now, every time someone dared to knock, equal dignity would be the hand that opened. Before leaving, Ethan glanced at the slogan on the wall. Justice is not charity, it's restoration, he whispered as if speaking to himself. No one needs pity. They just need to be seen. And when the door closed and the lights went out, only that line remained glowing in the dark, a vow from an entire generation that human dignity is not something to be granted, but something to be reclaimed. Morning light streamed through the windows of the Equal Dignity Foundation office, casting a soft glow over Ethan Carter's desk, where stacks of case files sat beside an open laptop. A new notification appeared on the screen, 1-year anniversary messages. He clicked. The inbox opened, flooding with emails, each line, each story a heartbeat, echoing from somewhere across America. The first email came from Trevor Parker, the flight attendant, who once dared to stand up against the very system he served. Mr. Carter, it read today, marks 1 year since the day I decided to send you those internal documents. I lost my job, my reputation, but I gained something far more valuable, the truth. Thank you for not letting me be forgotten. I now work at Rodriguez Consulting, Mariana's firm. We're helping dozens of organizations realize that real change doesn't begin with policy, but with the human heart. Ethan paused, reading every word slowly. A year ago, Trevor had stood at the edge of his career, willing to risk everything just to do what was right. Now he had turned his own fear into a tool for healing the world. Ethan smiled softly. One honest man can make an entire system bow, he whispered. The next email was from Catherine Blake, the journalist who had exposed the Sky Global scandal. Ethan, I remember that night in the little cafe when you told me you didn't want to become just a tragic story. Now you're a whole chapter in history. My latest article on Sky Global has been added to university courses on media ethics. I still keep the napkin where you wrote, "Dignity is not negotiable." You should know that those words have traveled farther than you ever imagined. Ethan leaned back in his chair, exhaling. He had written that sentence in anger, but now it had become the rallying cry of a generation unwilling to stay silent. Then came a video message from Alison Reed, the flight supervisor, who had once ordered him out of his seat. Her face appeared on screen, softer now, stripped of the cold arrogance she once wore. "Hello, Ethan," she began, her voice calm but emotional. "I'm not sure how to start this. I resigned from Sky Global after the hearing. Instead of hiding, I joined Mariana's bias recovery program. I'm now a trainer for new pilots and flight attendants. Every time I tell your story, the entire room goes silent. I can't undo the past, but I can help make sure no one repeats it." Ethan looked into her eyes, on the screen eyes that had once brought him pain, now filled with remorse and courage. Sometimes, he murmured, the greatest thing a person can do is admit they were wrong. Then came a message from Patricia Evans, the woman who had risked everything to expose the collusion between Richard Hale and Thomas Wilson. "I lost my position, my reputation, and even some friends," she wrote, "but I have no regrets. I now lead a program supporting women of color in aviation. They don't just learn how to fly, they learn how to stay, standing in the sky of prejudice. If one day you see a brown-skinned female pilot flying a Sky Global plane, smile, because that will be proof that your fight wasn't in vain. Ethan closed the laptop and sat still for a long time. The names, the people, the stories, they blended together like notes in a quiet symphony of ripple effects. Not the noise of victory, but the quiet resonance of real change. That afternoon, Ethan stood in the conference room of Equal Dignity. The walls were lined with photographs, faces, smiles and handshakes of those the foundation had helped. A young staff member entered, holding a fresh file. Mr. Carter, this just came in a group of Asian American students in Los Angeles, were denied a hall rental because they were deemed not culturally suitable. They're asking for legal support. Ethan nodded without hesitation. Take the case, he said. We're not just protecting them, we're protecting everyone who comes after them. The young staffer smiled. That sentence had become the foundation's motto. We protect the next. That night, Ethan left the office late. The city of Atlanta was glowing its high rises, shining like constellations. He stopped on the bridge watching the endless line of cars beneath. In the wind, he heard his mother's voice echo faintly in his mind, the woman who had once taught him that dignity was not something given by others, but something he must guard with everything he had. He pulled out his phone and opened an email Mariana Rodriguez had sent him a few days earlier. Ethan, she had written, do you remember the day I asked you, are you sure you want to return to the place that once broke you? Now I have my answer. We don't just return. We must return to turn pain into the path of healing. Ethan smiled, his gaze steady, his faith no longer wavering. He realized that Equal Dignity was more than an organization. It was proof that kindness can spread faster and stronger than hate. The next morning, at Sky Global's headquarters, Mariana Rodriguez sat in a meeting with her advisory team. On the table was a new proposal titled Inclusive Passenger Initiative. Beneath the signatures of approval was the name Ethan Carter. Mariana smiled, nodding slightly. The sky has opened, she said. Now it's our job to keep it clear. That same day, as a Sky Global flight took off from Atlanta, the captain, a young brown-skinned woman, switched on the intercom, her voice filling the cabin. Good morning, passengers. We are honored to take you to San Francisco today. And before we depart, I just want to say one small thing. This sky belongs to all of us. That evening, Ethan received the audio recording from a passenger who had been on that flight. He sat quietly, eyes closed, letting her words wash over him. The voice, the wind, the hum of the engines, and the feeling of freedom. A year ago, he had been forced out of his seat. Now he no longer needed to sit in first class, because he had helped the entire world learn how to share the same sky. The rain from the night before had just stopped leaving the streets glistening under the city lights. Atlanta was entering autumn, the season when the trees turned gold like brush strokes painted across a pale gray sky. Inside the new headquarters of Innovate Systems, the morning light reflected off a brass nameplate that read, Aisha Monroe, Chief Executive Officer. She stood by the window on the 25th floor, looking down at the long stream of cars, still finding it hard to believe she now occupied the seat once held by Ethan Carter, her friend, her mentor, the man who had redefined what leadership meant to her. A year earlier, when Ethan had told her he wanted to step down as CEO to focus on the Equal Dignity Foundation. Aisha had refused immediately. "You can't abandon ship just after the storm has cleared," she said, her tone almost reproachful. But Ethan had only smiled. No one wants to leave Aisha. But sometimes the one who starts rowing must hand the oar to the person who can see further ahead. And she understood he wasn't leaving out of exhaustion, but to teach the next generation how to steer on their own. Now, sitting in that chair, she could feel the true weight of every decision. On her desk was an email from Greg Walsh, founder of Apex Ventures, the same investor who once refused to back Innovate Systems after the Sky Global controversy. The subject line was short, but carried a tone very different from before. Proposal for partnership renewal. Aisha read the message carefully, her eyes sharp, though a faint current stirred inside her. Dear Ms. Monroe, after reviewing the remarkable progress Innovate has made in the field of ethical technology, Apex would like to reopen the partnership we once abandoned. We hope to meet with you and Mr. Carter to discuss the future of our collaboration. Aisha let out a quiet laugh. Reopen, she murmured. Sometimes that's just a polite word for regret. That afternoon, she drove to meet Ethan at the Equal Dignity office, carrying the letter and a trace of hesitation. Ethan was reviewing a case report when she entered. He looked up with a warm smile. "Let me guess," he said. Apex reached out. She nodded, placing the envelope on his desk. "Walsh wants to meet. They want to work with us again." Ethan nodded calmly. "I knew this day would come. The question is, do we want it?" Aisha sat down. "I'm not angry anymore," she said softly. "But it's still hard to trust. They turned their backs when we needed them most." Ethan was quiet for a moment, then said gently, "People don't learn from victory. They learn from consequences. And sometimes forgiveness is what makes them live the rest of their lives in gratitude." Aisha looked at him, her eyes filled with both admiration and compassion. "You never really get angry, do you?" Ethan chuckled. "It's not that I don't get angry, Aisha. I just choose not to let anger decide who I become." 3 days later, the main conference room of Innovate Systems was lit for an important meeting. Greg Walsh, the same man who had once sat across from Ethan in that fateful meeting in San Francisco, walked in his posture, humble his demeanor changed. His hair had turned gray, his smile uncertain, but his eyes carried something real remorse. "Ethan," he began, "I was wrong. And the worst part is when I saw you being humiliated, I stayed silent. I thought I was just a bystander, but that silence made me complicit. I don't ask for forgiveness. I just want the chance to do the right thing this time." The room fell silent. Ethan sat across from him, calm as if he had waited a long time to hear those words. "Mr. Walsh," he said, "if you had spoken up that day, things might have been different. But if you speak up today, the world still can be." Walsh nodded, his voice trembling slightly. "Then let me stand with you this time." No one clapped yet. The air in the room seemed brighter, lighter. Aisha looked at Ethan, and in his eyes she saw the passing of faith from one generation to the next. After the meeting, as Walsh left, Ethan and Aisha stood by the window overlooking the city, its towers glowing against the night sky. "Do you think the world is really changing?" Aisha asked quietly. Ethan replied in his steady voice, "No, Aisha. The world doesn't change by itself. People change, and they pull the world along with them." She smiled softly. "I think you just described yourself." Ethan laughed. "No. That's you now. You and the ones coming after you." Weeks later, Innovate Systems and Apex Ventures signed a renewed partnership agreement, not just in funding, but in ethical artificial intelligence research. The media called it the Alliance of Ethical Innovation. Together they pledged 10% of annual revenue to the Equal Dignity Foundation to protect individuals affected by biased or harmful technology. During the press conference, when asked why she kept Ethan on as a strategic advisor, Aisha simply said, "Because we're not building an empire, we're building a legacy." That night, Ethan returned home late. His apartment overlooked the Chattahoochee River, the city lights shimmering on the surface of the water. He turned on the TV and saw Aisha shaking hands with Walsh. The headline at the bottom of the screen read, "From Rivals to Allies, Redefining Trust." Ethan turned the TV off and stepped out onto the balcony. The wind was gentle, the city still alive with sound, but inside him was a rare, quiet peace. He whispered to himself, "The true value of a fight isn't in who wins or loses, but in whether the next generation can move forward without having to rebuild from the ruins." The next morning, Aisha sent him a message. "I just met the new group of interns. One of them said he joined Innovate, not for the salary, but because he wanted to work at the place that once changed the world. I thought you'd want to know that." Ethan smiled as he read it. He didn't reply right away. He simply looked out at the soft, pink dawn spreading across the horizon. Above the city, sky global planes passed through the morning light, a reminder that when one generation dares to rise, the sky for the next will always be wider. That morning, Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport was packed with travelers. Electronic boards flickered constantly announcing departures, while lines of passengers stretched before the check-in counters. Among the crowd, Ethan Carter walked, slowly holding a Sky Global ticket flight, 1273 Atlanta to San Francisco. No one recognized him. No bodyguards, no media, no PR entourage. Just a middle-aged man in a simple shirt, a backpack slung over his shoulder, his expression calm and quiet. Yet inside, he felt something unusual, a sense of walking back into his own past. Right here, more than 2 years ago, he had been forced to give up his first-class seat. And from that moment, everything had changed, not just for him, but for an entire system. As he passed through security, Ethan paused for a brief moment. The memories returned, the scrutinizing eyes, the whispers behind his back, the seconds he once pretended not to hear. But today no one looked at him like he didn't belong. A young white staff member glanced at his boarding pass and smiled warmly. "Good morning, Mr. Carter. Thank you for what you've done for the airline." Ethan stopped for a second, surprised that the man recognized him. He smiled and nodded. "It's nothing. I just did what anyone should have done." The young man replied, "Maybe so, but not everyone has the courage to." Ethan walked away, a quiet warmth rising in his chest. Sometimes the true power of change doesn't come from applause, but from a simple thank you. Inside the aircraft, the first-class cabin glowed with soft daylight. The cream-colored leather seats were perfectly aligned, the air faintly scented with fresh coffee. Ethan found his seat 3A. The same seat, the same window view. He placed his hand on the armrest, feeling the smooth texture of the leather. For a fleeting moment, 2 images overlapped before his eyes. Ethan from the past, the man humiliated in first-class eyes, burning with anger but saying nothing. And Ethan now the same man, but with eyes that carried an entire sky of forgiveness. The cabin door opened as passengers settled in. Across from him sat a young black man in a navy blue suit laptop, open adjusting slides on a presentation. He looked nervous, his brow furrowed quietly, rehearsing lines under his breath. Ethan saw in him the reflection of his own younger self the first time he boarded a plane for a crucial pitch before investors. The young man glanced up, caught Ethan's gaze, and nodded politely. Ethan smiled. "First time flying to San Francisco?" "Yes, sir. I have a pitch with the investment board tomorrow morning. How do you feel?" "Honestly, a mix of excitement and fear," the man said, half laughing. "That world isn't easy for people like me." Ethan paused, then said softly, "You're right. But that's exactly why, if you make it through, you'll be opening doors for everyone who comes after you." The young man's eyes brightened. "Someone once said the same thing, or maybe it was from your interview clip." Ethan chuckled gently. "Is that so? Then let's just say I'm repeating myself today." As the plane ascended, the morning sunlight poured through the windows. Below, Atlanta shrank, fading into the clouds. Ethan leaned back, closing his eyes. The engines roared steadily, the heartbeat of a generation learning to fly. Faces flashed through his mind: Mariana, Aisha, Trevor, Patricia, Allison. People who once stood on opposite sides, now sharing the same sky. If someone asked what the most miraculous part of his journey was, he would answer, it wasn't justice prevailing, it was hearts changing. Midway through the flight, a flight attendant approached a young black woman with natural curls and a radiant smile. "Hello, Mr. Carter," she said. "I don't know if I should say this, but I became a flight attendant because of your story." Ethan looked up surprised. "Really?" "Yes. When I was in aviation school, I watched your Sky Global speech. I told my mum that if you could stand tall that day in first class, then her daughter could step onto any plane and be proud of who she is." Her voice trembled slightly, but her eyes shone like stars. Ethan nodded gently, his throat tight. "Thank you," he said. "You just made this flight something I'll never forget." As the plane began to descend, the pilot announced their approach to San Francisco. The sunset cast golden light across the ocean. Ethan gazed out the window. The reflection of the sun on the wings glimmered like molten silver in the dusk. In that moment, he understood not everyone needs to sit in first class to prove their worth. What matters is who stands when their dignity is tested. When the plane landed, passengers rose one by one. The young man across the aisle turned and bowed slightly. "Good luck, Mr. Carter." Ethan smiled, resting a hand on his shoulder. "No good luck to you. The future belongs to people like you." They walked out of the cabin, and amid the flow of travelers, Ethan turned for one last glance. A group of flight attendants stood by the exit, watching passengers disembark, among them the young woman from earlier. She met his eyes and gave a small nod, her smile unwavering. In that look, Ethan saw more than gratitude. He saw a promise of the future. Outside the terminal, the wind from San Francisco Bay swept past him, carrying the scent of salt and the rhythm of a city alive. Ethan lifted his gaze toward the sky, where the Sky Global plane he had just left climbed westward, leaving a silver streak across the clouds. He smiled to himself and whispered, "Some wounds never leave scars because they've become the path." And that path, he knew, would continue, carried forward by new generations, learning to fly without fear of falling. Dawn cast a soft golden glow over Atlanta, wrapping the city like a warm blanket. The glass facade of the Equal Dignity Foundation shimmered in the morning light, reflecting the image of a city that had finally learned how to have an honest conversation with its own past. Inside the office on the 18th floor, Ethan Carter stood by the window, gazing down at the stream of traffic below. On his desk, his father's old watch ticked steadily, a small sound, yet firm and unwavering, like the heartbeat of the faith he had carried his entire life. Today was a special day, the 5th anniversary of equal dignity. Outside, journalists, guests, students, and people whose lives had been changed by the foundation were gathering. But Ethan remained still for a moment, wanting to take one last deep breath of this quiet before stepping out into the light. The door opened. Aisha Munro entered, her smile, gentle, her eyes shining with warmth. "The hall's already full," she said playfully. "How long do you plan to keep them waiting?" Ethan turned and smiled. "Just one more minute. I was thinking about my father." She didn't say anything, understanding that for Ethan, such moments were sacred. He spoke softly, his voice calm and steady. He used to tell me, "You don't need to shout to be respected. Just stand tall when everyone else bows." Back then, I was too young to understand. Now I do. Standing tall sometimes means facing the strongest winds. Aisha looked at him, moved. "You didn't just stand tall, Ethan. You built an entire path." In the auditorium, when Ethan walked onto the stage, everyone rose to their feet. The applause thundered across the room, but he simply raised his hand, asking for silence. His voice resonated deep, gentle, but firm. "A few years ago, I was stripped of a seat on a plane, and a seat in other people's respect. But then I realized something: your seat doesn't define who you are. How you respond when it's taken from you, that's what defines you." The hall fell into complete silence. Ethan paused for a beat, his gaze moving across the faces of the young student staff, the next generation, who would carry on the mission he had begun. Equal dignity wasn't born out of revenge. It exists to remind us that justice doesn't need to scream. It just needs to be seen. And the truth is simple: no one should ever have to trade their dignity for respect. A wave of applause erupted. Some wiped tears from their eyes. When the ceremony ended, Ethan stepped out onto the balcony. The morning sun touched his face, deepening the lines at the corners of his eyes, lines etched by both time and light. A group of high school students approached. The youngest, a 15-year-old girl, held an old newspaper with his picture on the front page. "Mr. Carter," she said shyly, "I want to be a journalist someday, like Miss Catherine Blake. I read your story, and I think if justice can start with one person, then maybe it can reach the whole world. Is that true?" Ethan smiled and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It is. And sometimes the world just needs one more person brave enough to begin." As they left, Aisha stood beside him and asked quietly, "Do you ever wonder what will happen to equal dignity when you're no longer here?" Ethan looked toward the sky, where the sunlight was breaking through the clouds, warm, confident, and alive. "It'll keep flying," he said, "because when an idea is born from compassion, it doesn't need someone to hold it, only someone to carry it forward." Aisha nodded softly. Beneath the morning light, Ethan's face glowed like his very name, a reflection of light, faith, and human dignity. The late afternoon sky over Atlanta glowed with a soft orange hue. The sunlight stretching across the glass facade of the Sky Global headquarters, where the ceremony announcing the company's global equality reform program was about to begin. Beneath a large banner that read, "One Sky for Everyone." Ethan Carter stepped up to the podium. His face no longer carried the tension of past years, but the calm assurance of a man who knew his mission had long outgrown the boundaries of his own story. In the front row sat familiar faces: Aisha Monroe, Mariana, Rodriguez, Trevor Parker, Patricia Evans, and hundreds of Sky Global employees, many of whom had witnessed, and some even taken part in the movement that reshaped the history of the airline. As the microphone light blinked on, Ethan stood silent for a few seconds. The room went still. He looked around before speaking slowly and clearly. Someone once asked me whether justice truly exists in a world ruled by power and profit. I thought about it for a long time, and today my answer is this. Justice does not exist on its own. It is created through every decision, every action, every person brave enough to say, "Enough." He paused, his eyes landing on the rows of young employees, listening intently. Years ago, I was forced to give up my first-class seat. Today I return not to reclaim that seat, but to make sure that everyone, regardless of color name or status, has the right to sit anywhere they deserve. The audience erupted into applause. Some bowed their heads, tears in their eyes. In the corner, Trevor, the man who had once trembled while holding a USB drive in a park, now watched with gratitude. He had become Sky Global's director of training, leading the first anti-bias program in the aviation industry. After the ceremony, Aisha approached Ethan, holding a small box in her hands. "Do you know what day this is?" she asked, smiling. "It's been exactly how many years since Flight 1273, Ethan laughed softly. "I remember. Why do you ask?" Aisha opened the box. Inside was a miniature metal model of an airplane, engraved with the words, "Seat 3A, the beginning of change." Ethan looked at it, his smile slowly melting into quiet emotion. Aisha continued, "We've decided to keep Seat 3A empty on every Sky Global flight as a symbol of the journey toward equality. No one can buy that seat, but everyone can learn from its story." Ethan stayed silent for a while before answering gently, "Thank you, Aisha. Not for the gift, but for understanding what I've always believed, that sometimes what we lose becomes the very thing that helps the world regain its dignity." As he left the building, the sun had set, completely bathing the sky in crimson. Ethan walked toward the airport and watched planes ascend into the twilight. Near the window stood a young black boy with his parents, pointing excitedly at the sky. "Look, Mum, I'm going to be a pilot," the mother smiled and said. "You can be anything you want, as long as you keep your kindness." The words made Ethan's heart tighten. He smiled softly, seeing in that boy the reflection of his younger self, the dreamer who once believed that if he worked hard enough, he would one day be seen as equal. Now he understood, true recognition doesn't come from others. It comes from the actions we choose to give back to the world. A light breeze passed through, carrying the sound of an airport announcement. "Sky Global Flight 1273 to San Francisco is now boarding." Ethan looked up. The sky stretched endlessly above him, glowing with color, no longer divided by boundaries, but connected by the luminous trails of soaring wings. He whispered, his voice rough but steady. "Not every flight takes us where we want to go, but some take humanity forward." And beneath that golden sunset, Ethan Carter smiled, not because he had won, but because the world had grown a little fairer. From the perspective of a leadership ethics expert, Ethan Carter's journey is not merely a story about justice, but a testament that true change begins when one dares to confront injustice without letting hatred lead the way. He didn't just reclaim a seat, he expanded the sky itself, so that future generations could rise with pride and dignity. In a world where power is so often used to suppress, Ethan proved that the greatest power lies in the ability to make others look within themselves. If you believe that fairness doesn't need noise, only the courage to do what is right, then, like this video to share that message, subscribe to the channel to never miss stories where compassion is tested by power, and comment below with the phrase that reflects your belief in human dignity: hold your dignity.